goal of annexing the.
Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteous and you are watching The World Report. Let's take a look at some of the top stories of the hour. The US and China have agreed a framework for a potential trade deal to be finalised when Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping meet this week in South Korea. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says the plan includes a TikTok agreement, a deferral of Chinese rare earth restrictions and no 100% tariff hike as Beijing resumes large soybean purchases. China says H-6K bombers conducted simulated confrontation drills near Taiwan ahead of this week's Trump-Xi meeting in South Korea. Beijing claims the self-ruled island as its own, though Taipei says it has not seen unusual military activity recently. US President Donald Trump leaves Malaysia for the second leg of his Asia tour, with Air Force One departing Kuala Lumpur for Tokyo. He will meet Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanai Takaichi, on Tuesday. Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva says US President Donald Trump has assured him a trade agreement can be reached to ease punitive tariffs. Lula spoke after meeting Trump on the sidelines of a Southeast Asian summit. Donald Trump congratulates Argentina's Javier Milei on his party's mid-term sweep, saying the people have, quote, justified Washington's confidence in him. Trump posted the message on Truth Social while touring Asia. The USS Gravely has docked in Trinidad and Tobago as the Trump administration intensifies pressure on Venezuela, with another US carrier group headed towards the region. President Nicolas Maduro denounces the move as a CIA-backed military provocation aiming to trigger a new eternal war. At least 4 people are dead after police clashed with supporters of opposition candidate Issa Chikroma in Douala ahead of Cameroon's election results. Protesters defied a ban as they claim President Paul Biya has been voted out. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel will decide which countries can join a planned international force in Gaza under US President Donald Trump's ceasefire plan. With Hamas refusing to disarm and Arab states hesitant to send troops, Israel continues to raise concerns over the force's makeup. Now we start this hour in Europe, and Ukrainian officials have said that an overnight Russian drone attack on Kiev killed 3 people and wounded dozens, including 7 children. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has confirmed the attack in a statement. Zelensky has also added that Ukraine has been struck by 1,200 drones in just 1 week. Let's take a listen in to his statements.
А сьогодні тільки у Києві від російської атаки 3 людини загинули. І ще 31 людина постраждала. Серед них є діти, 7 дітей. Ми дякуємо кожному, хто допомагає людям, кожному рятувальнику, всім в комунальних службах, хто дійсно працює, щоб допомогти. Тільки за один цей тиждень росіяни застосували проти України майже 1200 ударних дронів і вже 50 ракет різних типів. Більшість якраз балістичні. Захист від такої загрози може бути тільки спільною справою. Жодна нація в світі не має залишатись наодинці проти такого.
These strikes came just a day after another Russian drone and missile strikes, and they killed 4 and wounded around 20 others in Kiev, according to Ukrainian authorities. Meanwhile, the governor of the Bryansk region in Russia has said that a Ukrainian drone has hit a minibus, and the governor has said that the attack killed the driver and injured 5 other people. Russian state media has also reported that Russia's air defense units have destroyed 193 Ukrainian drones overnight. We're now joined by Professor Veselin Popovsky. He's a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School, and he joins us live from New Delhi. Professor Popovsky, President Zelensky says 1,200 drones have come over from Moscow in the past week. What does that say about Moscow's strategy now? Is it quantity over precision now from the Russians towards Ukraine?
Well, obviously the purpose of this is to inflict damage, mostly civilian damage. We see 3 people killed in the capital, Kiev. And the Russian strategy is basically to make the life miserable and to kill as many people as possible. It's a horrible, nasty strategy, somehow to make Ukrainians demoralized, but they will not. Ukrainians are strong, and they will defend their country, whatever Russians wants to do. Usually, you know, Thomas, in the media reports from Russia, there is always kind of the good news. They would like to report that they capture a village here, capture a village there. They destroy some infrastructure and people as well, because they want to please their dictatorial leader. Whereas if we look at the Ukrainian side, it's always a care for human life. And that's why we kind of get an impression that the Russian army is advancing, which is not, and that many civilians are killed, but they are not. They are basically weekly. We have between 10 and 20 weekly civilians die in Ukraine. The worst was in June and July, no longer that, because the air defense system of Ukraine is building stronger. And it will build more and more stronger. Exactly, Zelensky is doing the right thing. He is reporting every casualty in order somehow to send the signals, the message to the West, and not only to the West, to the entire world, that Ukrainians are the victims of illegal invasion, aggression, war crimes daily, and for that matter to receive the necessary support, including military support.
What options are available for Ukraine diplomatically and militarily now?
Well, diplomatically, Ukraine is open for negotiations. In fact, Zelensky is happy to meet anybody, including Vladimir Putin. He never rejected such a meeting, but Russians are not ready for diplomacy. You see, every time when it comes to some hope for a diplomatic solution, the Russians are backing down. They don't want a ceasefire. The simple thing here is to ask a ceasefire. What Donald Trump should say to Putin is, don't tell me about meetings, stop the fire for 1 week, and then I will go to meet you wherever you want me to meet you. But Donald Trump doesn't do that. He simply promised a meeting, and he invited Putin to Alaska. Well, hopefully he will not meet Putin in Budapest now, because there should be some conditions for that meeting, and the conditions should be ceasefire. Unless Russia agree on ceasefire, there is no diplomacy, as simple as that. On the military front, Ukraine needs more support, and that's why Zelensky is making the pledges, including in Washington, including for the long-range missile system that can destroy military objects deep into the Russian territory, which will somehow turn into the equation, because Russians will feel the pain themselves from what they are doing, and that will speed up also the diplomatic solution. So for diplomacy to work, Moscow needs to be pressured, including with long-range missiles. You see how Putin was very scared when Donald Trump announced Tomahawks to be supplied. Those further messaging, actually actions by the White House, could be very significant, exactly as to put the Russians seriously on the diplomatic table.
Yes, Professor Popovsky, thank you very much for joining us and giving your insight, as always. It's a pleasure to hear. We now move on over to the Indo-Pacific, where US President Donald Trump departed Malaysia to meet Japanese Emperor Naruhito on Monday at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. This meeting is scheduled 6 years after their previous meeting during Trump's first term as US president. President Trump, after attending the 47th ASEAN Leaders Summit, declared Malaysia a great and very vibrant country. During Trump's visit, the newly elected Taipei is expected to affirm plans by her predecessor to increase military spending and to make $550 billion in Trump-directed investments in the United States. Meanwhile, Tokyo residents have also shown hope for good trade relations with the United States ahead of Trump's visit. Let's listen in.
いいトレードを持ってきてくれればラッキーなんですけども、そうなるかどうかはトランプさんの中に関係してくるので想像がつかないんですよ。いきなりロシアを味方してるかと思えば急にゼレンスキーさんの友達みたいな顔をしてやるでしょ。それが予測できない。最初はうまくいくと思うんですよ。お互いに主張は激しいですから。ただこっちがコロッと変わった時に高市さんはずっと同じ形で主張していきますよね。ある意味で体系的にというか。だからそこでガチンとくるかなという感じは私も。
We're now joined by Ross Feingold. He is a political analyst and he joins us live from Taipei in Taiwan. Thank you very much for joining us, Ross. It's a pleasure as always. Ross, of course, Donald Trump departs Malaysia for Japan and meets the Emperor today. However, his most anticipated meeting in Japan will be tomorrow, where he meets the newly appointed Conservative and first female Prime Minister, Taipei, who is continuing the plans to raise defence spending. How much of that, do you think, is driven by US pressure, and how much by regional threats like China and like North Korea?
It's a combination of the two. President Trump began to put significant pressure on Japan as well as South Korea to dramatically increase their defense spending during his first term. Biden continued that, but I think obviously the difference in personalities between Biden and Trump is going to be extremely direct and in making clear that his government, his administration expects Japan to significantly increase defense spending. Now, new Prime Minister Takeshi Sanai, she is committed to defense spending increases, but whether or not she'll be able to get through the Japanese parliament a level of spending that Trump wants, that remains to be seen.
Yes, and Ross, of course, this $550 billion in US-directed investments, which was promised under the Ishiba government as part of the Japanese trade deal. Is this genuine economic cooperation, or, of course, Tokyo bowing to Trump's transactional demands?
In a way, it doesn't matter. And the reason why I say that is Japan has made that commitment. Now, it was under the previous government, as you pointed out. But as of now, there's no reason to believe that the new prime minister is looking to change that deal. So the details have yet to be put into black and white, and they're still talking about that. But there's no indication that she's going to try and significantly change that deal. So I mean, from the American perspective, this is a very good deal. It brings in a lot of investment. It will create jobs and manufacturing in the United States. Japan also made a lot of changes that will facilitate the export of U.S. goods and services to Japan. And Japan got out of it that the U.S. imposed a lower tariff rate than had initially been threatened by President Trump. So I think the new government in Japan is still looking at this as a win-win. And again, there's no indications that she was trying to significantly change the terms of the deal.
Ross, stay with us. We have more diplomacy coming up from the Indo-Pacific, where Brazilian President Lula da Silva has now spoken about his meeting with the US President Donald Trump at the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur, calling it the most enthusiastic meeting of his schedule in the Malaysian capital. Speaking about the conclusions of the meeting, President Lula said that his American counterpart has promised to make a deal with Brazil amid tensions in the backdrop of the exorbitant tariffs imposed by the USA on Brazil. The Brazilian president has also put forward his willingness to help the USA with its campaign against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, signaling a deeper shift in South American regional geopolitics, as this makes Brazil the first country after Argentina to support the USA in its campaign against Venezuela. Talks between the two presidents also touched upon the trial against former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who Trump was very vocally supportive of as he faces the courts on charges of insurrection. He faces prison time now of over 20 years. Here's what the Brazilian president had to say about the meeting.
Eu estou convencido de que em poucos dias nós teremos uma solução definitiva, sabe, entre Estados Unidos e Brasil, para que a vida siga boa e alegre.
We're once again joined by Ross Feingold. Ross, of course, Brazil faced one of the highest tariffs in the world after some to and fro between Lula and Trump. A 50% tariff, even though Brazil had a trade surplus with the United States. However, now things seem to have thawed, and it was all smiles in Kuala Lumpur. Trump seemed to have promised Brazil a new deal, but with the US still punishing Brazilian exports, who actually holds the leverage here, Washington or Brazil?
It still seems to be Washington. Brazil wants to have a good relationship with President Trump, with the United States, but we have this judicial process with Bolsonaro that has caused a real rift between the current governments of the two countries. The U.S. is also eager to make sure that Brazil, like other countries in the region, don't come too close to China. And that's an area of significant disagreement. Lula wants to maintain an independent foreign policy. He's built a good relationship with China and Xi Jinping and participating in alternative multilateral platforms like BRICS. So it's difficult to see where they could see eye to eye on that issue as well. Frankly, I think whatever nice things that President Lula and Trump might say about each other coming out of this meeting, that might only last a few days. I think it's difficult for these two to be on the same page going forward. So I would expect actually that it's going to be difficult to resolve some of these differences and actually see a reduction in the tariffs.
Ross, a huge topic of conversation recently has been that of the Caribbean, that of the Maduro government. Does Brazil support, legitimize Trump's push for regime pressure in Venezuela? And how will this reshape regional blocs like BRICS, for example?
This is one of those things where, again, I would say that no matter what nice things Lula or Trump say coming out of this meeting, as long as the United States continues its anti-drugs activity in the waters of the Caribbean, it continues its pressure on the Maduro regime in Venezuela, I think Brazil and Lula are going to react negatively to that, and Lula is going to criticize that. And that's going to lead to counter-criticism from President Trump. Really, it's unlikely to expect that Lula would welcome additional sanctions or pressure or even a regime change in Venezuela. That's just not his position. So this is one of those things where the U.S. and the current government of Brazil have very different opinions, and it's very difficult to reconcile those different views.
Yes, and Ross, Lula has historically defended Latin American sovereignty and condemned U.S. intervention, which the United States, of course, has a long history of in South America. What explains his sudden willingness to align with Trump's hardline Venezuela strategy?
Again, I'd be careful about saying Lula is actually aligned with Trump's policies on Venezuela. I think this really remains to be seen. It's probably safer to assume that Lula is going to revert to criticizing U.S. intervention or pressure and to take the side of Venezuela. On the other hand, Lula claims to be somebody who cares about democracy and cares about human rights and the rule of law. And one cannot say they support democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, and then be supportive of Maduro's regime in Venezuela. The two positions are inherently contradictory. And that's one of the things that Lula struggles with, because on the one hand, he doesn't want U.S. intervention in the region. On the other hand, he knows what a terrible despot that Maduro is.
Yes, indeed. And of course, the Bolsonaro factor. Donald Trump went so far as to put sanctions on the judge who was adhering to Bolsonaro's trial. How awkward is this meeting politically, given Trump publicly backing Bolsonaro, and given that verdict, now Bolsonaro has been found guilty?
Well, again, whatever nice things the two say about each other coming out of the meeting, we have to deal with the reality. The reality is that this judicial process is playing out. There'll probably be appeals that will take a lengthy amount of time, but in the interim, there's this guilty verdict, and Trump vehemently disagrees with this, and he's made his criticisms quite public, including the sanctions on the judge that you referred to. And there's no meeting of the minds on this. You know, Lula could say that Bolsonaro is a terrible person, but I can't interfere in the judicial process. The judiciary is independent. And President Trump is going to disagree with that. And President Trump is going to make his views very well known, whether he does that on Truth Social or via the State Department. And I think the two guys are just going to revert to their original back and forth disagreements in statements and social media.
Ross Feingold, it's always a pleasure to talk to you and have you on the program. Thank you very much for taking the time. Argentinian President Javier Milei's La Libertad Avanza party rebounded from a series of setbacks to take 40.84% of the votes cast for members of the Chamber of Deputies and Senate, according to official results based on 90% of votes counted. The Argentine president has hailed his party's runaway victory in the midterm elections as a turning point for the country and vowed to charge ahead with his agenda of shrinking the state and deregulating the economy. He promised to continue on the reform path with what he predicted would be the most reformist Congress in Argentina's history. The President Donald Trump, a close ally, congratulated Milei and said his Argentine counterpart was doing a, quote, wonderful job. Let's take a listen in.
Hoy claramente ha sido un día histórico para la Argentina. El pueblo argentino decidió dejar atrás 100 años de decadencia y persistir en el camino de la libertad, el progreso y el crecimiento. Hoy pasamos el punto bisagra. Hoy comienza la construcción de la Argentina grande.
Now, in Georgia, hundreds have taken to the streets of Tislibi to mark 1 year since the country's disputed parliamentary election. Protesters accused the ruling Georgian Dream Party of winning through fraud, echoing claims made after last October's vote. Demonstrators waved Georgian and EU flags, calling for democracy and closer ties with Europe. Opposition leader and former President Salome Zourabavishvili said most Georgians remain firmly pro-European and want democratic reforms. Authorities had responded forcefully to protests last year, and tensions between the government and opposition continue to simmer. Let's in fact listen in to what the former president of Georgia and some of the protesters had to say.
The vast majority of the population has always been and remains pro-European, wants democracy, wants independence, doesn't want to become a Russian colony. And that is a responsibility also for the European Union. It's a responsibility for us, and we're standing there because of that, but it's also a responsibility for our partners.
ბოლომდე იმიტომ რომ ერთ-ერთი გამოსავალი იმ მდგომარეობაში რომელშიც ჩვენ ვართ არის ბრძოლა იქამდე სანამ რეჟიმი არ ჩამოიშლება ბრძოლა ერთიანად და ერთად გონით ერთი ძალისხმევით სადაც ყველა პარტიები იქნებიან სტუდენტები იქნებიან ყველა ის ადამიანი რომელსაც უკეთესი მომავალი უნდა ამ ქვეყანაში დადგება ერთად სწორედ ამის ეჩინია რეჟიმს
ალბათ ესეთი ერთიანი ერი არ ყოფილა იმისთვის რომ გვინდა ევროპული მომავალი მხოლოდ და მხოლოდ მშვიდობიანი გზით და ასევე აუცილებლად უბრალოდ წარმოუდგენელია ამ მთავრობასთან ერთად ამ ქვეყნის ევროპული მომავალი. ამიტომ ასევე ჩვენი მოთხოვნა არის ამ მთავრობის გადადგმა.
ფაქტი რომ ქართველი ხალხი ყოველთვის მისი ასე ვთქვათ პროგრესული ნაწილი ვერ შეეგუება იმ უსამართლობას, რომელიც დღევანდელ საქართველოში არსებობს და ამის მთავარი მიზეზი არის საქართველოს დღევანდელი ხელისუფლება, რომელიც ყველანაირად მაქსიმალურად ებრძვის საქართველოში დემოკრატიას.
Well, that is all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from across the globe.